I have a funny sense of humor, but sometimes it gets me into trouble. Last year, actually no, just about 20 months ago, I spoke to the Alberta Engineering Association in Red Deer. So I flew into Calgary and I was driving up to Red Deer. Now, the Alberta Engineering Association, these are the folks that build bridges and tunnels and highway infrastructure for the province of Alberta. And so as I was driving up there, I thought to myself, what does a guy who's lived under a bridge and tunnel for 7, 10 years of his life say to people who build bridges and tunnels for a living? And the best thing I could come up with was, thanks. I do have a dark sense of humor, but sometimes, as I say, it gets me into trouble. I was going through the border in my car last year, and I got up to the border crossing, actually just down the street here at Sumas. And a fella at the border, great big Mexican-American fella, he had to be about 300 pounds, and he had a name tag that said Bert. And I opened the conversation with, "Hey, Bert." Yeah. Now, a guy with my kind of history ought not be testing his luck at the border, you know? It's like, that's the last place you should be pushing the envelope. That was a long afternoon for me. I got down, I got on the plane, and I flew to New York to speak to a large banking consortium. I don't want to mention their name because I don't want Bank of America to sue me. And I opened with this joke. Now, I tested this joke with my friends. I said, what do you guys think? Should I open with this? They said, oh, yeah, it's brilliant. They'll love it. So this is the joke I opened to 1,600 banking managers in Manhattan for the Bank of America. I said, you know, in the 1980s, the police wanted to talk to me about a bank robbery. I said, bank robbery was a credit union. See, you guys think it's funny. 1,600 bankers in Manhattan didn't. It was another long afternoon. In 2003, I was honored with the Courage to Come Back Award. This is a fundraiser that's put on by Coast Mental Health to acknowledge 6 extraordinary individuals who've overcome adversity, and I was one of those humbled with that award for overcoming chemical dependency. And I remember I was down there, and I was in a room with Peter Legge and the mayor at the time, Philip Owen, and there was a bar. And I don't know, maybe it's an old habit, I found myself hanging around the bar, and the bartender says, would you like a drink? And I'm thinking, would I? But tonight would probably not be the best night to start drinking again, considering the circumstances. So I politely declined, but you know, the customer service was really good at the Bay Shore, and he kept asking all night, would you like a drink, would you like a drink? Finally I said, you know, I cannot have a drink because I am allergic to alcohol. He says, my goodness, what kind of reaction do you have when you drink? I said, I break out in handcuffs. He left me alone. I believe that having a sense of humor allows us to take the tough stuff that life gives us. We're walking down the road, minding our own business, and life lifes us. We face adversity, challenge, and change. We face it in our families. We face it in our communities. We face it with funding. We face it with our health. But the great thing about having a sense of humor is it allows us to shift that perspective, and it allows us to see things anew, see things in a different light, see things from another perspective. And I think that one of the greatest things that I got from my family is the ability to have that sense of humor. Because I truly believe it to be the greatest weapon that we could take to adversity today. Wouldn't you agree with that? Yeah. And for me, that's really important. Because there were a lot of days in my life where there was not much to laugh at. In 1989, that was a picture of me. I'd made every conceivable poor choice that a young man could make. And I ended up living on the 100 block of East Hastings. Yeah. Life didn't start off like this. I came from a good place, a very, very good home. I had a mom and dad that loved me very much, and there was no indication at all in my family that I was going to grow up and become that. But it's a testament that when children make poor choices at a young age, they can make 1 or 2 poor choices that ultimately changes the trajectory of their life. And that was the case for me. You know, when Dave was up here talking about 29.1 and 27.8, I know those, you know, those 27.9s. I know some of those boys. I know some of them that ended up in Squee and Kent. And they were, you know, they weren't bad kids. They were just kids doing dumb things that ended up, you know, harming the community, harming themselves, and harming other people. And they, you know, they threw their lives away. I grew up in a very typical middle-class family. I had a dad that went to work and a mom that stayed at home. I had an older brother and a younger sister. And my childhood, I can remember, I remember I had some hairline fractures in my self-worth at a young age, but things were good. Things weren't bad. But at a really young age, my father got snatched from our family. And a lot of things changed and shifted. And the man that would then go on to replace him, he wasn't that loving, supporting, caring man that used to play baseball and used to take me camping and used to be there. He was less than supportive. And so I went from, this father that I looked up to that I could do anything in the shadow of, to a man who said, "You're stupid, you're dumb, and you'll never amount to anything." Now, when I share that with you, friends, I share that with you not coming from a place of victimization, okay? That's really important. It's just a story today for me. It doesn't have impact like it used to, because I realize today that, I've forgiven that guy a long time ago. He was simply working with the tools that he was raised with. And so, families, sick people just continue to perpetuate and hurt people. And that was simply the case in our family. But at the age of 8, I didn't know how to sort that stuff out. And so when the opportunity presented itself, I was 9 years old, I got high for the first time. And in my little community, a little community much like Abbotsford, I started sniffing glue. And that continued, and by the time I was 14 or 15, I'd graduated. I was then doing alcohol and marijuana. By the time I was 15, I was non-compliant at home. Like Dave said, I was that rebellious. I was a rebel without a clue. I was angry at the world. I had a chip on my shoulder, and was non-compliant. And so I left home. By the time I was 16, I was in prison for the first time. And by the time I was 17, I was this guy right here. I remember I left Ontario, the little town that I grew up in, Midland. I eventually moved to Barrie, and then I moved out here during Expo 86. And over the course of, within 2 months, I went from having a little SRO to living underneath the Georgia Street Viaduct. And I was one of those young men that pushed a shopping cart around town. I was one of those young men that used to go to that recycling center. And that's what my life had been reduced to. I used to go underneath that viaduct every night with that shopping cart. And I would hope that I could get through the night. By the time I was in my late teens, 18, 19, I was completely wrapped around heroin. That was my drug of choice, and it was an incredible bondage for me. And I didn't know how to break that cycle. I didn't have the tools. There was many days where I woke up and I didn't want to continue on that path, but I didn't know how to get out. And I'd wake up and I'd push that shopping cart down underneath from the Georgia Viaduct, and I'd go to the downtown east side and I'd do the bins. And back then there wasn't a lot of people doing it like there are now. I was a bit of a maverick. And that was my existence. And I remember the loneliness, and I remember the desperation, and I remember wanting anything to get out. And I also remember having that split sense of identity, knowing that there was more in me than this. I was a good kid, but I didn't know how to bust out. I didn't know how to find my sorry self. And so I continued on that path. I remember one faithful meeting, and I met a guy named Gus. He was this old guy, and I saddled up beside him because he had cigarettes, and I was a mooch. All right, give it a name, right? That's just what I was back then. And I would approach people and beg change and ask for cigarettes. And this guy gave me something absolutely incredible. It's turned into the mantra of my life. I sat down beside him, and I asked for this cigarette, and he gave me a cigarette, and he gave me $2. But then he gave me something huge. He said, there's more in you than you can see. You can't see it right now, but there's more in you than this. A couple weeks later, I'd hit my bottom. I woke up underneath that viaduct. I was in a deep state of withdrawal, and I wanted to get out. And I needed $10, and I needed to get well. I was beginning to descend into that withdrawal. And to explain withdrawal, it's like the worst flu you've ever had in your life. That flu, if you can think back last year, or even if it's been more recent than that not being able to sleep, just the relentless head pounding, hot sweats, cold sweats. The distinguishable difference with opiates is you know that $10 will make it go away, at least make it go away for another 6 or 8 hours. And so you're willing to do whatever it takes to get that next $10. And I woke up and I was going through that, and I had no money, I had no more connections, I had no friends that had any means whatsoever. I burnt virtually every bridge I had. And I walked down and I walked into the local pub, kitty corner to Pigeon Park in downtown East Vancouver. And I had one thing that was worth money. One thing that is essential if you're on the streets in the wintertime in East Vancouver. One thing that I could sell and get $10. I walked into that bar and I left without my boots. It was late December and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I needed $10. And I remember walking up that 100 block of East Hastings with the rain pouring down. The only thing that was merciful is that it hid the tears of shame that streamed down my face. I said, I'm a good kid from a good family. You know, how did I end up down here? And I didn't have an answer for that. But it was in that moment that I cried out for help. And you can call it a prayer or you can call it a cry to the universe, however you want to define that. I asked God for help. And I made 2 promises. I said, if you crack the door open just this much, I'll run through that door and I'll never look back. And I said, and if I get the opportunity at some point, I'll do something to help others. A couple weeks later, Mom came out, and I had to break the news to her, you know, how far my life had gotten. And she wrapped me up like good moms do, and she took me home to Ontario. I didn't get clean right away, but about 2 years later, I did. I entered into full residential treatment. I went through the detox process, and I went to Belleville, Ontario, and recovery for me began the first time on July 26, 1991. And that was the process of me beginning to peel back the onion layers of who Joe really was as a man. And I remember when I was in high school, I was a solid D-. I was a smart kid, I just wasn't there very much. I had other things going on. But the first decent decision I made in my recovery was I went back to college. And I remember I had one thing in mind when I hit that college campus. Well, actually 2 things I had in mind. I said, you know, 6 months ago, these guys wouldn't have let me use the bathroom here. All right? And then the next thing that ran through my head is, boy, is there ever a lot of empty cans around here. The education thing doesn't work out. 25 cents in a Safeway carton, I'm in business, baby. Anyways, I put my head down. I let my professors know, each one of them I took aside, and I let them know what my history was. Not because I wanted to do the self-disclosure. I wanted them to understand the context in which I viewed the world in case I was acting a little off. And they began to draw out the best in me. And that guy who I met on the street, Gus, he spoke the truth. And over a short period of time, this kid who got solid D's in high school started to get A's and B's. And the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years. And finally, on that faithful day, beautiful, bright, sunny June afternoon, I stood in that auditorium, and they called out my name. They said, Joe Roberts, Dean's List. I graduated with a 3.94 GPA after 4 years. And I still didn't get a haircut. I showed this in Victoria last year, and a fellow who wasn't wearing his glasses came up and he goes, how long did you know Sally for at Loyalist? I said, no, it's not Sally, man. For me, change comes slow. Yeah, they say anything I let go of has claw marks in it. Anyways, I got a haircut the next year, as soon as I got a JOB. So I graduated, and I remember a lot of things about that day, and probably one of the most significant wasn't the Dean's List, wasn't the accolades, wasn't my friends in the audience. It was walking off that side stage and seeing Mom, who never stopped believing in me, sitting in that seat full of pride. Not everybody has a mom like mine. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm dedicated to the work I do today. Because I'm one of the luckiest guys in the world to have that. after graduating, I needed to make a decision on where I was going to plant my flag in the business world. I didn't want to live in Toronto anymore. I looked at Calgary, didn't like winter. I looked at Montreal, didn't speak French. Quite frankly, I was sick of shoveling snow in Ontario, and I decided to head west. And I ended up camping out on my brother's couch. He lived in Richmond, and a good friend of his worked at Minolta and said, why don't you go, actually the instructions were, Minolta hires people with no job experience and spotty resumes. Why don't you go talk to them? And I said, okay, thanks, I think. And I walked in and I got hired right on the spot. And I remember there was this guy, Lanny. He became that next person in my life to draw that more out of me. You know what I mean? I graduated college. I had a good foundation of recovery in my life. Anyways, I began to, I put my head down and I started to do really well as a sales guy. Turns out the transferable skill set that I had was communications. Anybody here ever read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers? Malcolm Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours of mastery. If you want to get good at something, do it for 10,000 hours. Well, the thing that I did for 10,000 hours was communicate and connect with people. I mean, when I was on the street, my survival depended upon it. In between collecting cans, it was all of this communications, like 22 hours a day. There was this connection with other human beings in the context of me wanting to get something that I wanted. And so when we took away the lack of integrity, I began to do really, really well in sales. And one thing turned to another, and after about a year, I left Minolta, and I got a job in sales management. And that led to another role as the business development director in a small tech company, and the year was 1996. And the dot-com explosion was absolutely taking off. And within 11 years, because of those people who had invested in me, I went from that kid who pushed the shopping cart around the downtown east side to being on the cover of Canadian Business and acknowledged by Maclean's magazine in their honor roll issue recognizing 10 Canadians who make a difference. I stand for possibilities, not because I went to a Tony Robbins seminar, but because I've personally been through that transformation. And when I look at kids, I say you're one decent decision away from walking away from it all. You're one bad decision from walking into it all. And with the right mentorship and the right leadership, we can change and transform the lives of children. We absolutely can. Does that to say that every kid that we connect with is going to transform? No, but the possibility is in each and every one of them. If we look at a kid who's at risk and we go with a probability mindset, this has always been this, therefore this will always be that, we've lost. We have to hold that place of possibility. If we can't see that possibility and we can't hold that possibility for those kids, we've lost the battle right there. It's that subtle mind shift. But when we have that, transformation can occur. In 2003, after 12 years of doing really, really well, I relapsed. And I went from being the guy on the cover to losing it all and going through a real shameful spiral downwards. In fact, this is probably only about the 10th or 15th time that I've talked about it in public. There was a lot of stuff that I never really dealt with at a deep core level that was that sense of fracture of self-worth for me. And I went from having all of these things in my life that didn't really mean a lot to going through this devastating downward spiral. And that continued for several years of my life. But in March of 2007, March 2007, I got sober again, and I went through the process again, and this spring I'll have 6 years sober again. As a direct result of some of that and a personal choice, I left the business world in the traditional sense that I was there. I didn't want to be a CEO and an entrepreneur anymore. I wanted to be a thought leader. I wanted to speak. I wanted to speak in the lives of kids. I wanted to work inside companies. I wanted to work with HR departments. A couple years ago, I started a consulting practice with a friend of mine and business partner, Dr. Sean Richardson. And today, the work that I do is a lot of this. I do a lot of speaking. We do a lot of training. In fact, we work with a few clients here in Abbotsford. Everything from human skills development to keynoting at conferences, sharing this idea of transformation. And I do a lot of philanthropy work as well. Last year in October, I had a distinguished honor to go and speak for Aeroplan Canada. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to have a corporate social responsibility project where they took their people and actually immersed them in what it would be like to be homeless. And they didn't want to tell them about it. So I was game. I mean, what do I got to lose? Just another night outdoors, right? Anyways, they flew me into Montreal, and what happened over the next 30 hours was nothing less than transformative, not just for them, the community, the organization they supported, but for me. I went in and shared my story, and at the end of it, in this crowded room with 350 people, I asked, who here wants to now make a difference? Given the opportunity, if you can leave here, nothing changes, or we collectively over the next 24 hours could do something absolutely extraordinary to possibly change the lives of some young people. Who here is with me? 320 put their hands up. The other ones kind of just quietly grumbled along, right? And what we did next was absolutely cool. We did 3 exercises. The first one was they made sandwiches. And those sandwiches were distributed through an organization called Dans la Rue, which is an organization on the streets of Montreal that services the 2,500 to 5,000 kids that are on the street on any given night. The next thing they did is I never thought in my wildest dreams I was ever going to do a seminar on how to panhandle. But there I was teaching these corporate executives how to panhandle. I did a seminar on panhandling. I still can't believe that. They all got these signs and these markers, and 350 people got on school buses and entered into the subway system of Montreal. And over the next 2 hours, at 35 subway stops, they connected with over 170,000 commuters. And I was incognito. I had a hoodie so they couldn't see who I was because everybody had already met me. And I was bouncing around from stop to stop watching their creativity and how they enrolled and engaged. And I was watching the people who were leaving, who were richer even though they had parted with some money, because they were enrolled in the idea that what they were doing was making a difference for these kids. The next thing they did is they got their sleeping bags and they slept outside in front of the Bell Center parking lot. It was October the 10th. And I don't know if I need to tell you, but October in Montreal isn't warm. And the following morning, when they tallied up all the dollars, they had raised over $80,000 in one day to support kids on the street. I got on an airplane and went home, and there was this something bugging me about, I've been playing too small with this story of mine. What if we took this idea and, and we really put some fire behind it? What if this wasn't just that hot tub experience, feels good when we're in it, but when we get out, nothing changes? What if we were able to engage and enroll Canadians right across this country? What if we could do something like this every night for a long period of time? If we could make 80 grand in one day, what could we do with a year? What could we do in every Canadian city? And these were, I've always thought big, and these were some of the things that were really bugging me. I'm sitting across from the guy that used to be the CEO of Coca-Cola telling me that that was the most impactful CSR engagement award he's ever had in his history as an executive, and he was 17 years at Coke. And I'm thinking, we got to do something, man. We got to do something. And I had no idea what it was. But I just kept saying to Sean, I said, we got to do something. We got to do something. And I bugged him and bugged him and bugged him for about a month and a half. And finally, we were flying into Calgary and we were going to work for Cloverdale Paint. And we were talking to say, okay, engagement. We were just throwing ideas around. We get all caffeinated and then have these discussions that last 4 hours, right? He's an intellect and I'm out to lunch. And so having this conversation, we said, well, what has worked in the past? What's worked? Okay, engagement. How can we inspire? How can we get people into action? We said, well, who's done it before? Let's take a look at the templates. Well, look what Terry Fox did. Look what Rick Hansen did, right? And we started thinking. And then Sean says, Well, shopping carts represent homelessness. Why don't you push a shopping cart across Canada? And we can put the money towards kids at risk. You know when you have one of those defining moments in your life? That was one for me. Because no sooner did he say it, I looked at him, he looked at me, and there was a shiver that went down each of our spines. And then I turned to him and said, hey, wait a minute, how come I got to push the cart? We went to work that day, and I went home drunk on an idea of change. And I started to walk on my treadmill. And I posted that I'd just done a marathon on my treadmill on a Saturday. And then on Sunday, I posted I just did a half marathon on my treadmill. And in 2 days, I walked over 60K. Next thing I know, the phone rings. Sean is a performance psychology, but he wrote his PhD in overtraining. He trained twice for the Olympics and failed, and then decided to squeeze something out of that experience. And that's what he did his doctorate. He says, what are you doing? And I didn't have the guts to tell him, because I wasn't afraid about walking across Canada. I was afraid of how that was going to affect our business relationship. Because, you know, it's like, hey, we've been in business for a year. I need to take 3 years off. Do you mind? And when I told him what I wanted to do, he said, I'm in. I'll help you. Whatever I can do to support you. And so together, Sean and I began to move this thing forward. That was how the Push for Change was started. Next thing we said is, well, we need a shopping cart. You can't push a shopping cart across Canada. I mean, have you pushed a shopping cart outside of the grocery store? I have, man. They're not friendly in alleyways, potholes, and sand. And so we said we need something lightweight. The other thing that we looked at is, look, you know, Terry and Rick, they were young, athletic men when they decided to take on the challenges, all right? I mean, Rick was an Olympic, you know, an Olympic medalist, and I'm not. I'm a middle-aged, soft-in-the-middle business guy, and so we got to training. And between January and June, I walked over 1,700 kilometers in training. We knew that we needed a shopping cart. We went and we asked the local kids at the high school if they'd come up with a design. Then when I was training with Sean's wife, Kate Richardson, she was my personal trainer, she had one of those chariot carriers. You ever see these gals in the park and they're running or they're on the bicycle and they got one of those fancy, one of those fancy carriers? Well, she had one of those, and I looked at it and I went, you know, if you put a cage on the front of that, you could make a shopping cart out of that. And so that's what we did. We called Chariot Carrier, and on their website it says our motto or our slogan or our mission is to safely move children from one place to another. So I called them up and I said, that's what we do too. Will you help us out? 4 days later, $2,000 worth of equipment was in my living room. The local kids came up with the concept. We went down to the local metal fabricator. They put the cage on, so now we had a cage. And then we had to go and we had to get some sponsors, because we knew that we didn't want to be, you know, we didn't want to be on the road taking donations from folks and having it pay for the trek. We wanted to create a separation. So we got a real simple rule. Any money that people give us goes into a legacy fund, and 100% of that goes towards the causes. What are the causes? Early and late intervention, education, and in the trenches type of stuff. So those are the two things that we want to support. But we didn't want to have to take money that we were collecting on the side of the road and put it into our gas tank or our breakfast at Denny's. And so we asked, and people gave. Fraser Way RV showed up with an RV for us. You know, Epp family, an extraordinary group of people out there. And that was a big concern of mine. How are we going to do this? This is, you know, we also looked at, okay, how are we going to cross the country without any revenue to start? That's when Sean said, well, what you need to do is you need to do a trial trek, training. You need to do something before you do something. I said, okay, so I'm going to walk across Canada, but before I walk across Canada, where do I got to walk from? He says, from Calgary. I said, wait a minute, so I got to walk from Calgary to Vancouver, and then the following year I got to walk across the country. He said, exactly. I said, okay. And so we started with this small piece, which was Calgary to Vancouver, and that's what we started on July 1st of this year. But before, going back to the first 2 quarters of this year, we needed sponsors. Elks Canada came forward and wrote us a check to cover some of our costs. Cloverdale Paint came forward. They're a client of ours. who believe in our possibility mindset and believe in our vision. Salvation Army, who was there for me 20 years ago, jumped on board and provided venues and people to help support and get the word out. So that as we came through, when we left Calgary, it was from the Center of Hope. And in Kelowna, it was with the Salvation Army. And then it was out here with Devil Owl over at Cascade. And then it was over with over in Langley at the Gateway of Hope. And then eventually right back to my alma mater, the 100 block of East Hastings and the Harbor Light. We asked TELUS if they would help us. TELUS is an extraordinary company. So my joke here is I picked up the phone and called TELUS. And I actually get to work side by side with a Canadian legend. My contact at TELUS is Steve Poborski. And told him what we wanted to do, and the team got behind it, and they wrote a big check. And so, armed with all of that, they loved this when I tweeted it, by the way. I took that and sent it up on Instagram this summer. We embarked from Calgary to Vancouver on July 1st. Our goal was 56 days. The distance between here and there was 1,071 kilometers. And we wanted to see if we could do it. And so we now needed a driver. We had an RV, we had a cart, we had gas money. Who's willing to give up their summer? And I didn't have a lot of people who were takers. And then, you know, as serendipity would have it, on Facebook, a friend said, I really like what you're doing, I want to support you. And I said, thank you. I said, why don't you go and ask some different people that you may know in your circle of influence who have driving experience who'd like to give up their summer. We have a small stipend, but it's not very much. He emailed right back and he said, I'm willing to do that. Here's what's extraordinary. That man and I were friends 25 years ago on the 100 block of East Hastings. And he's got 5 years sober. He stepped into it. His name's Robert. And he drove the bus. Incidentally, he's a professional driver. You start to get the idea that this is all fallen into place, right? Then we hired a cinematographer to capture the message, and we headed towards Calgary. The thing that made me the most nervous was whether my body could take it. 6 days on, 1 day off, walking 24 kilometers, getting up at 5 o'clock every morning, and to do that. I didn't know whether my body could take it. I'd done a lot of training, but that kind of consistency frightened me. First day out of Calgary, it put us near Callaway Park, which is where this sign is here. And we began to walk. And we began to walk. And we began to walk. And we walked through Canmore, through Banff, through Lake Louise, through Yoho National Park, through Kicking Horse Pass, through Golden, through Glacier National Park, through Rogers Pass, through Revelstoke, through Sicamous, through Enderby, Armstrong, Vernon, Kelowna, West Bank and the Bill Bennett Bridge, Peachland, Summerland, Penticton, Carameus, Princeton, Manning Park, Hope, Agassiz, Desroches, Mission, Abbotsford, Pitt Meadows, Coquitlam, Port Moody, Burnaby, and Vancouver. You never really know what you've got in you until you have the courage to step into it. I think that when I look at kids that are troubled today, I just want to yell at them and say, there's so much in you that you guys can't see, but life circumstances have colored a particular shade for you, and that's what you see when you look out into the world, and that's what you see when you look into that mirror. This summer was as much building a template for the national campaign as it was for me pushing through some of the harshest barriers I've ever had to push through. And I'm up for the national. When I came into Vancouver, this was only supposed to be training, and we were joined by 150 people. A documentary film crew, and on top of the one that we hired, was there to meet us. And there was this groundswell that began to happen in the media that we didn't expect. One of the articles that was covered is this one in 24. We made the third page of the province. We were on the CTV National News, and we were in more print pages throughout the Fraser Valley than we can count. I want to share with you this little video. It's about 4 minutes. Then I got a couple more slides, and then I'm done for the night.
We were talking about, well, what do Canadians do to make a difference? We were, you know, thinking about Terry Fox and Rick Hansen. Canadians have a history, a legacy of trekking. And so in that context, I kind of had this idea, like it just popped to my mind of this kind of vision of Joe pushing a shopping cart across the nation. And I spoke the words. I said, well, I don't know, Joe, why don't you push a shopping cart across Canada?
Myself and Robert got in the RV here in Vancouver and drove to Calgary. The idea was we go start in Calgary and work our way back to Vancouver, because Vancouver is my hometown. It's also the neighborhood that I escaped from 23 years ago. So going into July 1st, there was a lot of anxiety. Like, how am I going to be able to walk 24 kilometers every single day, 6 days on, 1 day off? That frightened me.
Hi, Joe Roberts here. It's around 6:30 in the morning. There's a support vehicle. We're just starting outside of Lake Louise. Should be at the BC border in about an hour and a half.
The more memorable moments, probably Rogers Pass, Kicking Horse Pass. Then the heat came on, and it was hot this summer. Got up to 32, 33, 34 degrees, and then we left Princeton. 22 kilometers into it, we had another 20 to go, and if you know the area, that's the Hope Princeton Highway Pass. And it's nothing but hill. And then you get some hill, and then you get some more hill, and then you get a big hill. And that hill is about 8 kilometers, and it goes to the top of the mine. It's got a hairpin turn on it. There wasn't even any shoulders. And you got trucks coming down, and it was crazy. And we crested and climbed, and finally found ourselves on the top. I completed a marathon in 35-degree heat. It was amazing. You know, up until 10 days ago, coming into the downtown east side, we didn't expect what we got. I didn't even know if we were going to have a police escort or if I was going to have to walk that shopping cart on the sidewalk. Because let's face it, once you get past Boundary, I mean, this is a city. Again, Hastings is an arterial route, and we chose it deliberately because it's East Hastings. And then we hit those buildings where it echoed. And I don't know whose idea it was, but they just started hollering, "Go, Joe, go. Go, Joe, go." And there I was, you know, I'm in the 100 block East Hastings. Place I used to be dope sick in, place I used to scuffle. You know, and I just felt a lot of pride.
Here he was, living on the streets of downtown Vancouver, pushing a shopping cart around, sleeping under a bridge, heroin addict. Many people would walk by someone like that and say, lost cause. Late intervention is about saying it's never too late. Extract the best out of people. You know, it's a passion for helping people. And the real starting point to that is actually seeing something extraordinary or something amazing. Seeing possibility in the people around you.
For back those blocks left years behind before I found the key, I realized that kid I saw was nothing more than me. Behind me is a broken man. A man you see now free. Life is grand when we understand. There's more to us than what we see.
On May 1st next year, the national campaign commences. It's 8,600 kilometers, and we're going to go completely across the nation. Our goal is to help these kids. It's to see that possibility in kids like Cameron and Sydney, and to take a stand and to be the voice for their invisibility. Ultimately, not every kid has that great start or has that great parent, but we all come from this place. I'm fortunate enough to come from a really good family, but as I said earlier, not all kids have that. So if I can take my story and my history and a little bit of time out of my life to do something to create a legacy for these kids, if nothing else, it speaks volumes to the idea that we're not going to give up on them. We share that in common at Abbotsford Community Service and Stand Up for Youth. You may never know the impact you have on these kids' lives, but I can tell you tonight when I go home, there's a little girl that's glad her daddy's clean and sober. And that has more to do with you than it has to do with me. Thanks.